Medieval sieges in movies look grand and fast, filled with fire, roaring catapults, and fearless knights charging into battle. The reality was slower, dirtier, and far more human. Sieges lasted for months or years, ruled by hunger, disease, and exhaustion, rather than glory. Behind the walls and beyond the gates, life was brutal, messy, and uncertain. The myths that shape how these wars are shown on screen create a world of fantasy that barely resembles the truth. Number 1. The myth of the quick siege. Movies turn sieges into short bursts of chaos and glory. Flames rise, catapults roar, walls collapse, and victory comes before nightfall. Real medieval sieges moved at a crawl. They were slow wars of hunger and waiting. The Siege of Acre in the late 12th century lasted nearly 2 years. Thousands of men spent more time digging, building, and starving than fighting. Armies didn't arrive ready to storm walls. They needed to set up camps, gather food, dig trenches, and cut off supplies to the castle. That could take months. Once the defenders were trapped, the real battle was time itself. Soldiers watched the sky for disease more than for arrows. Fleas and bad water killed faster than any sword. Rotting meat, spoiled bread, and dysentery turned the camps into graveyards. Most days passed in silence. Archers waited for orders that never came. Engineers repaired siege towers that broke in the rain. The smell of waste and death hung over everything. Movies skip these parts because patience is not cinematic. They show walls collapsing in minutes, but stone took days to chip. Catapults needed whole teams of men to fire a single shot. After each impact, engineers checked for cracks and damage that rarely appeared. Sometimes the walls stood untouched after weeks of effort. When the defenders finally surrendered, it wasn't because of explosions or heroic charges. It was because they were out of food and hope. Starvation turned strong men into ghosts. Bread made from ground straw or rat meat became a last meal. Many surrendered just to survive another day. The myth of the quick siege hides the truth of what medieval warfare really was. Not a storm of fire and steel, but a long, rotting test of human endurance. Number 2. The myth of endless catapult fire. Movies turn catapults into unstoppable machines that never rest. Stones fly every few seconds, walls crumble under constant fire, and the ground shakes without pause. Real catapults were nothing like that. Each one was a massive wooden structure that demanded strength, time, and coordination. A team of soldiers had to wind the ropes, load the sling, and position the weapon before every shot. One launch could take 10 minutes or more. After that, everything started again from the beginning. The pace was slow and exhausting. Ammunition was another problem. Every stone had to be shaped and hauled across muddy ground. Transporting these heavy projectiles took hours, sometimes days. Armies could not waste them. Many sieges used only a few shots a day. Each one was valuable and planned carefully. Accuracy was poor. Most stones missed the walls completely or landed harmlessly in open fields. Sometimes they bounced back toward the attackers, breaking legs or smashing wagons. Hitting a wall was an event worth cheering for. Even then, the damage was usually minor. Thick castle walls could absorb hundreds of impacts before showing cracks. The main goal of catapult fire was not destruction, but fear. The sound of a massive rock cutting through the air and crashing into stone was terrifying. Defenders hid under shields, praying the next one would not hit them. The noise carried across the fields, shaking morale on both sides. The psychological weight of waiting for another strike could break soldiers faster than any weapon. In truth, catapults were slow, imprecise, and limited tools. Their power came from the dread they created, not from endless, flawless barrages shown on screen. Number 3. The myth of invincible castles. Movies show castles as if they were impossible to destroy. Massive stone walls rise out of the mist, guarded by soldiers on every tower, surrounded by moats so deep no one could cross them. Real castles were far less perfect. Most of them were built to intimidate, not to guarantee safety. Many fell without a single stone being launched. Hunger was the most effective weapon in medieval warfare. Armies surrounded the walls, cut off the supply routes, and waited. Inside, food vanished faster than anyone expected. Bread grew moldy. Water turned foul. Animals were eaten one by one. When desperation took hold, even the strongest garrison began to crumble. Engineers often avoided direct attacks. Breaking through thick stone walls was costly and slow. They preferred to undermine them instead. Miners dug tunnels under the base of a wall, supported the roof with wooden beams, and filled the space with dry materials. Once the beams were set on fire, the tunnel collapsed, and the wall above it followed. A single corner breaking apart could destroy a fortress that had stood for decades. Fire was another simple answer to great defenses. Torches and burning pitch turned wooden gates and towers into traps. Flames spread through rooftops, creating panic inside the walls. Castles also had weak points. Many were built quickly with mixed stone and mortar that couldn't handle years of stress. Rain, frost, and poor repairs left cracks that siege weapons could exploit. A well-placed battering ram or catapult strike could finish what time had already started. When a breach appeared, defenders often lost the will to fight. The sight of a collapsing wall shattered morale faster than starvation. Castles looked mighty from afar, but their strength depended on the people inside. Once fear took over, even the thickest walls became meaningless. Number 4. The myth of noble knights leading the charge. Movies often show shining knights galloping through fire and smoke, shouting battle cries as they lead their men straight into the heart of danger. Real warfare was far less glorious. Knights were valuable, heavily trained, and extremely costly to equip. Their armor, horses, and weapons could equal the price of a small village. No commander would risk them in a reckless assault against fortified walls. Siege battles depended on patience, not courage. Knights usually directed troops, managed logistics, and waited for the moment when open field combat became possible. When fighting did reach the castle gates, the scenes were nothing like the organized charges seen on screen. The ground was thick with mud, rubble, and blood. Arrows rained down from towers. Soldiers stumbled through ditches and broken ladders. Knights fought on foot more often than from horseback, weighed down by armor that trapped heat and limited vision. They swung swords in narrow spaces, where one wrong step meant slipping into a ditch or getting crushed by falling debris. Many fell not from enemy blades, but from exhaustion or suffocation inside their helmets. The clean duels between noble warriors that fill movie screens never existed in real sieges. Combat was chaotic and filthy. Men fought for inches of ground, hacking through wooden barricades and pushing through burning gates. Those who survived faced disease and rot rather than glory. Siege warfare was a grinder that spared no one's dignity. Knights were not the fearless leaders of fantasy tales, but professional soldiers following calculated orders. Their courage lay in endurance, not in charging through flames. The myth of noble knights leading heroic assaults hides the truth of medieval war, where survival was the only true victory. Number 5. The myth of boiling oil. Movies often show castle walls lined with defenders tipping huge pots of boiling oil onto screaming soldiers below. The image is dramatic, but completely wrong. Oil in the Middle Ages was a luxury. It was used for cooking, medicine, and religious rituals, not for throwing away during battle. Few fortresses could afford to waste it. Most defenders turned to cheaper and more practical options. Boiling water was common. It was easy to prepare and caused painful burns. Heated sand worked even better. Once poured onto metal armor, it slipped through small openings, scorching the skin beneath and forcing attackers to retreat. Animal fat was sometimes used, especially from pigs or cows, since it was more available than oil. When melted and poured, it clung to armor and caused blisters. Quicklime was another brutal weapon. When mixed with water, it released heat and created a burning reaction that blinded and suffocated anyone caught beneath it. Defenders often dumped stones, broken tiles, and timber from above. Gravity was their best ally. A single boulder dropped from a height could crush several men at once. The real strategy of castle defense focused on slowing enemies rather than killing them instantly. Gates were reinforced with iron and soaked in water to resist fire. Archers targeted unprotected faces and joints. Crossbowmen fired from narrow slits, hidden from return shots. Every step toward the wall became a fight against exhaustion and fear. The idea of cauldrons of oil is a legend created by centuries of storytelling and cinema. Real medieval warfare was practical, dirty, and driven by survival, not spectacle. The truth is less theatrical, but far more human. Defenders fought with whatever they had, and victory often depended on endurance, not boiling oil. Number 6. The myth of constant heroic battles. Movies turn medieval sieges into endless waves of chaos, where the clash of steel and the roar of fire never stop. Real sieges were long stretches of waiting, disease, and exhaustion. Armies spent weeks sitting in mud, surrounded by the smell of rot and smoke. Most soldiers never saw a real fight. Their days passed building siege towers, digging trenches, and carrying supplies. Rain turned the ground into filth. Food spoiled quickly. Rats spread sickness faster than arrows could fly. The noise and blood that fill the screen were rare in real life. Actual assaults happened only a few times during an entire siege. Commanders avoided them whenever possible. Attacking a wall meant death for hundreds of men. Archers from above could shoot down anyone who got close. Defenders dropped rocks, poured sand, or threw spears through narrow gaps. Even the bravest soldiers hesitated to approach. A single step too far could mean an arrow through the neck or a skull crushed by falling stone. Most of the time, both sides stared at each other across a field of mud, waiting for hunger or disease to finish the job. Fires burned at night as men whispered and listened for the creak of enemy machines. The real drama was silence. Fear built up in that quiet. Every sound carried weight. A catapult groaning in the distance could freeze a whole camp. The constant action seen in films hides the truth that medieval war was often slow and paralyzing. Heroic charges and fiery battles were rare flashes in a dull and miserable routine of cold, hunger, and dread. Number 7. The myth of common people, watching from afar. Movies often show peasants standing on distant hills, watching castles burn and armies clash, as if war were some kind of grim performance. Real life was nothing like that. When an army approached, the first victims were always the people who lived nearby. Crops were trampled by horses and wagons. Fields that took months to plant were ruined in a day. Soldiers raided barns for grain and slaughtered animals for food. Villages became temporary camps, stripped of anything useful. Those who resisted were beaten, enslaved, or killed. Families fled with whatever they could carry. Roads filled with refugees, sick and starving. Many never made it to safety. Hunger spread faster than the battle itself. Nearby towns that took them in quickly ran out of food and space. Disease followed, carried by exhaustion and filth. Plague, dysentery, and typhus turned the countryside into a nightmare. For many peasants, survival meant hiding in forests, caves, or church basements, praying that both armies would pass without noticing them. Some were forced into the conflict. Lords demanded labor from commoners to dig trenches, build fortifications, or haul stones for siege engines. Women carried water and tended the wounded. Children scavenged among corpses for food. The smoke and screams of war were not a distant sound, but a constant presence. The illusion of war happening over there never existed. When castles fell, the destruction spread in every direction. Homes burned. Livestock vanished. The ground itself turned to mud, soaked with blood and ash. Medieval warfare was not a spectacle for bystanders. It was a collapse of everything ordinary, leaving silence where entire villages once stood. Number 8. The myth of a single decisive victory. Movies end sieges with a single victory that changes everything. The gates fall, the hero raises a flag, and peace returns. Real medieval warfare never worked that way. Most sieges ended in exhaustion rather than triumph. Armies negotiated truces when food ran out or when both sides were too weak to continue. Gold often decided the outcome more than courage. Defenders sometimes bribed attackers to retreat, while commanders accepted payments to spare a castle from destruction. Some garrisons opened the gates in secret deals, betraying their own lords to save their families. Others were betrayed by those they trusted most. When reinforcements arrived, battles reversed overnight. An army celebrating victory one day could be slaughtered the next. Even when a castle did fall, chaos followed. Looting began as soon as the gates opened. Soldiers ransacked homes, tore down walls, and hunted for valuables. Civilians were dragged from hiding places. Executions were common. Fires spread through towns that had already been starving for months. Disease grew in the aftermath. Rotting bodies, ruined food stores, and contaminated water wiped out more survivors than the fighting itself. Victorious lords often argued over spoils and territory. Promises made before the siege were broken once the fighting stopped. Mercenaries demanded payment and turned violent when they didn't receive it. The survivors faced famine and poverty for years. Fields destroyed during the siege took seasons to recover. Villages vanished completely. What looked like victory from a distance was ruin up close. Medieval war rarely brought clear winners. Every side lost men, money, and hope. The idea of a single decisive victory belongs to legends and films, not to the muddy, uncertain world of real medieval warfare.